In this video, we'll be discussing congruence, and congruent means that items that are the same in both size and shape. So how can we determine if things are congruent? Well, with lines, you can use a ruler. With angles, you can use a protractor. And with shapes, you can use a ruler and a protractor. Now, for the sake of what we're going to be doing, you do not need to use a ruler. We're not going to be super precise with this. We can just use our eyes for the sake of our unit that we're going to teach in Math 6. So let's do some practice. Determine whether each pair of lines is congruent or non-congruent. Write your answer in the space provided and explain the method you would use to determine congruence. So we have two lines. These lines look to be about congruent. If you were to lay your pencil on the horizontal line and then lay it against the vertical line, they look to be congruent. So yes, they are congruent. And you would use a ruler to measure lines. The next two, you could do the same thing with your pencil. Lay your pencil against this line, lay your pencil against the second line. Yes, they are congruent because they're the same size and shape, and you would use a ruler to determine if they're congruent. Now, the last two that are here, if we look at this set of lines and we measure it with our pencil sideways here, and then we measure this line, the first line is actually larger than the second line. So no, these are not congruent, and we would use a ruler. And then number 4, you can just kind of look to see, are they congruent or not in this angle here? And yes, they are congruent, and because they're angles, we're going to use a protractor. All right, I want you to do 5, 6, and 7, determine if they're congruent or non-congruent. And here are your answers for 5, 6, and 7. Okay, so if we look down at the bottom, how does this relate to congruence of polygons that we're going to talk about in 6th grade? So if two polygons are congruent, their corresponding sides are congruent. Now, corresponding means matching. And their corresponding angles are congruent. So the corresponding also means matching. Corresponding means matching, or corresponding means matching, actually. It could also mean congruent. So let's label the congruent corresponding sides and angles. So let's talk about the corresponding sides. When we look at a shape, these are two triangles, we're going to look at the sides as line segments. So this side here is line segment AB. So AB is congruent to DE. Do you see how they're matching? AB matches with DE. Those two are congruent to each other because we know that they're telling us that they're congruent, therefore they have to have the same measurements. Okay. If we do AC, line segment is congruent to DF because it's in the same location. So line segment DF. Now you need to make sure that you put them in the right order. If you go from the top down to C, you also have to do the same thing when you're writing it over here. You have to go the top down to F. The order of the letters matters. You can't go top down and then go bottom up on the other one. And then the last one, BC, is congruent to EF. So line segment BC is congruent to line segment EF. And I'm putting these little dashes here. These little dashes tell us that they're congruent to each other. So the first side is congruent to the first side. The second side is congruent to the second side. The third side is congruent to the third side. Now let's talk about corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are congruent to each other. So angle A, which I'm going to put one little swoop in there, angle A, and I wrote a little angle, is congruent to angle D because it's in the same location. Angle C, and I'm going to put two little swoops in it, is congruent to angle F. And then angle B is congruent to angle E. All right, and this little symbol that I'm drawing, this is the congruent symbol with an equal sign with like the little swoosh on the top. So let's look at the next page. So in a congruent statement, the vertices identifying each polygon are written so that congruent vertices appear in the same order. For example, in the diagram below, write triangle CBD is congruent to triangle PQR. So if I follow the order C to B to D, if I look at the swoops in the corner, 1 to 2 to 3 swoops, and then I have to do the same thing. P is 1 swoop, Q is 2 swoops, R is 3 swoops. These little swoopies I'm talking about in the corners here, they tell us they're congruent. So we can look to see vertex C matches with P because they're in the first order. B matches with Q. D matches with R. So order matters in this case. Two polygons are congruent if all pairs of corresponding angles are congruent and all pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. So if all the sides are congruent, if all the angles are congruent to the second shape, to their corresponding sides, their corresponding angles, the two shapes are proven to be congruent. So that's where our little activity that we did at the beginning of the lesson comes in to this part. So let's look at an example. Determine whether the triangles shown are congruent. If so, name the corresponding parts and write a congruent statement. So let's go through, let's do the corresponding sides. And I'm going to start at X because that's where the first little swoop is here. So X to Y line segment is congruent to X to Y. And now I have to go from the first swoop to the second swoop on the other shape. So M to N line segment is congruent. Then if I have Y to Z, so 2 swoops to 3 swoops, Y to Z is congruent to, I'm going to put a little mark here. So that's our first set. Y to Z is congruent to 2 swoops to 3 swoops to N, L. Make sure they're in the right order. And you can see they're both measured as 9. And the first set both were measured as 6. And then our last corresponding sides are going to be Z to X. And you could put X to Z if you wanted to. I'm just doing Z to X. And then we have to match it with the other one on this shape, which would be, and I went Z to X, so I went 3 to 1, so I'm going to go L to M. So there's your 3 corresponding sides. There's only 3 corresponding sides because it's a triangle. There's only 3 sides. So you're matching up the 3 sides. Now the corresponding angles, I'm going to match up the swoops. So angle X is congruent to angle M because M only has 1 swoop on it. Angle Y has 2 swoops, so it's congruent to angle N that has 2 swoops. And then angle Z is congruent to angle L. So this is a congruent pair of shapes. So if we write a congruent statement, I'm going to go around the triangles in the same order. So I'm going to say triangle, and I'm going to start with the first swoop. X, Y, Z is congruent to M, N, L. Triangle, M, N, L. And I can look to see X, Y, and M, N are congruent to each other. That's what it says right here. Do you see how they're paired up in the right order? And then we said YZ, YZ, and NL are paired up together. You can see they're in the same order. And then Z to X is there, and L to M is there. You can also match the angles by doing the same thing. X and M are in the same location, so they're congruent. Y and N are in the same location, so they're congruent. Z and L are in the same location, so they are congruent. You do number 1 and number 2, and then you try. So here are your answers for number 1 and number 2. So you have your corresponding congruent sides here, and then you have your corresponding congruent angles. If you look at the little tick marks, they're actually telling you that they're congruent, and they're matching them up for you. So 1 tick mark matches with 1, 2 matches with 2, 3 matches with 3. And then you can check the angles. Remember the little box in the corner means 90 degrees. So R and D are the same. And then P and C are the same, and Q and B. And you can see that from your congruent statement. So P and C match, Q and B match, R and D match. Side PQ matches with CB, QR matches with BD, PR matches with CD. Okay, now for number 2, they're not congruent. And you can tell that they're not congruent because if you look at the measurements, we have an 8 and a 4, and then a 4 and a 7. 8 and 7 do not match, so they're not congruent to each other. So all you have to write is not congruent for that one.